where appropriate, land to palm oil. And again, thinking about rubber. There's one thing I also want to think about is in terms of the increased cost of fertilizer. So that's thinking about the outputs. These are all the outputs, the products that you'll get, but also thinking of the inputs. The inputs, for example, for fertilizer, it's gone up a massive amount. Again, nearly 100% in the last couple of years, and it's increased even more because of the reliance use on gas and oil and the implications that will have. So if you're thinking about that as an input and the price rises in the input, what does that mean for farmers? What does that mean for people that maybe smallholders that don't have much money and are seeing basically that their costs increase significantly? And they need to ensure that they can address those costs and pay for the fertilizer. So what do? Maybe if they can't afford the fertilizer, they have to burn more, for example, for rice husks, for example, so they can use the rice husks to help with the fertilize their land if they're doing paddies, for example, rice paddies. This is just more detail on the agricultural commodities if you want a copy of this presentation. And then last couple of things, thinking about the implications of this, thinking about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how Asia Pacific as a region is doing on the SDGs. And unfortunately, not doing well enough, far from it actually. So basically, this is where the line 2021 is where we should be as a region if we are going to achieve the targets for 2030. And you can see none of them are we on target. And you can actually see on climate action, we're actually reversing because of, for example, increased emission from industry, from transportation, but also from conversion of burning of forests, for example, conversion of forest emissions from forests being destroyed. So this is again thinking about the bigger picture. If we're talking about achieving the SDGs, it requires a lot of input, a lot of investment, and that investment has to come from governments, national governments, but also donors to a certain extent. But the money has to be found, the resources have to be found. And it is a challenge, it really is a challenge. And one needs to really think about this bigger picture when thinking about how governments are developing their policies, how governments are governing their countries, their landscapes, and what they're trying to do. And you can see that it really is, it's very complicated and very, very challenging, as I said. Focusing on one particular area. So we've seen rural poverty going down. We also see issues of food security. And this is again looking at, so here we have Southeast Asia here, South Asia, so that would be India, for example, Nepal. You've got much higher level of rural poverty, of food insecurity. But you can also see it exists in Southeast Asia. And here it's broken down into severe food insecurity. And that is basically when you've got families, households that really are significant risk of running short of food and actually have days where they do not have enough food. And then moderate food insecurity is when there is that threat, when they don't have food, when households do not have food. And it is a significant problem in the region. And to be honest, I imagine it's going to be a bigger problem in the region as a whole in the next few years. And that is reflecting COVID situation, that is reflecting the cost of living, but also, for example, the terrible situation in Myanmar, the conflict in Myanmar, and the implications that will have on food security in the region. So thinking about the solutions then, thinking about how we can move forward and address that. So remember, I was talking about the drivers earlier on, thinking about agriculture, conversion of land, thinking about economic development, and so on and so on. And now thinking about what would be the responses to that. And what I'll do is I'll go into a few of these. So thinking about approaches, thinking about, for example, indigenous people and local communities, strengthening their rights, thinking about conservation programs, thinking about legality, focusing on legality of the products, timber products, for example, but also palm oil, thinking about sustainable sustainable supply chains, thinking about also how these supply chains and products and things are funded. And then also thinking about as an integrated approach at the higher level, the approach that we should be thinking about, for example, REDD+ and jurisdictional approach. So thinking about as a country as a whole, again, taking Indonesia, how Indonesia needs to manage its different forest resources from a landscape all the way to a national level, thinking about the different programs that they have to ensure that they can protect their forests, but also, for example, benefit from their forest landscapes, and ensure that the country is developing and growing in a sustainable manner. So I'll unpack a few of these briefly, also recognizing the amount of time that we have left. So thinking about legislation, so some countries, for example, consumer markets, you've got the EU timber regulation, focusing on keeping out illegal timber from the European Union. And that's been in place for quite a few years, for 10 years now. Thinking about the China Forest Law, which was reformed in which came into force in 2020 in Article 65, which is talking about keeping illegal timber out of the supply chain. I'm thinking about the processing markets as well. So where a lot of timber goes to get processed and then gets exported to elsewhere in the world. Thinking about Vietnam introducing its VNTLAS, its Timber Legality Assurance System in Vietnam. Similar for Indonesia, introducing its Timber Legality Assurance Mechanism in Indonesia with this SVLK, which has been around for quite a few years. And all of these, basically what they're trying to do is address issues of legality and keeping illegal timber out of the markets. And this is very important. And to be honest, the mixed results, and there's lots of analysis that's been done, including by previous organizations that I've worked for, EIA, the Environmental Investigation Agency, which, for example, says that there is progress, but more needs to be done. And one thing I do want to emphasize here, and I think is notable, is if you're going to address issues of timber legality, of unsustainable practices, it can't be done in consumer being critical of the producer countries. It needs to be done in partnership. For example, the EU working with Indonesia to support Indonesia address issues of illegal timber entering the supply chain. Partnership is fundamental. It really is very, very important. And then thinking about forest risk commodities, so thinking about palm oil, soya, for example, and so on, the different legislation that is coming in, for example, in the EU, the UK, and hopefully in the US as well. And then basically what it's trying to do is reduce the footprint when it comes to these commodities have on forests. So deforestation. So thinking about palm oil, the objective is that if the palm oil is imported into the EU, for example, only comes from sustainable sources and is not coming from forests that have been illegally deforested, for example. And it's very, very important, these legislative initiatives in the consumer markets, but also in the producer markets. Indonesia, as I said, with its palm oil moratorium, so not converting any more forest to palm oil plantations. Also other commitments, you've got the Glasgow, so the UNFCCC meeting last year in Glasgow, that's my home city, the Declaration on Forest and Land Use, which basically what it was trying to do is basically 6 components of this declaration. And basically it's saying that we are going to protect our forests. So 141 countries basically saying we are going to do more to protect our forests. And this, a lot of text I know, but basically these are the 6 components of it, and it's looking at conserving the forest, but it's also talking about sustainable trade. It's also talking about enhancing the rural livelihoods. It's also talking about improved agriculture, so taking the landscape approach, thinking about the financial side of things as well with point 5 and 6 in terms of ensuring that funding going into agriculture and forest use, for example, is recognizing the importance of protecting and managing these forests in a sustainable manner. Other initiatives at the national level, talk about community forestry programs. You have the CBFM, for example, community-based forest management in the Philippines. You have CF community forestry, for example, in Cambodia and many countries in the region, village forestry in Laos, for example. And basically the rationale for this is you start off that local communities know the forest the best. They depend on the forest the most. They have proven to be the most effective forest managers and have rights to their forest. Very simple view, but it's a strong rationale, compelling rationale, and one that in terms of it's worthy of discussion and worthy of exploration more. And then unpacking that a little bit more. So if you give people living in around these forests, if you give them strong and clear tenure rights, what impacts would that have? What would that mean on environmental, economic, and social levels? Thinking about just a couple of examples, thinking at the social level, if a community has strong and clear tenure rights from a social level, they will have clear regulations about how decisions are made within the community, what that will mean in terms of on issues of inequality, what will that mean in terms of on conflict. If you think about economic perspective, thinking about if they have strong and clear tenure rights, that means they individually and as a collective will invest in their forest economically, but also in terms of time. And if they increase the investment, that means they will get more back on their investment. Also thinking the environmental perspective, again, clear, strong tenure rights, people will invest and protect their forests more. And the implications that will have, for example, climate change adaptation and mitigation. So thinking about how then this has happened and grown across the region. So RECOF, we've been monitoring this for quite a few years, 2010 when we first started monitoring. And you can see, for example, Cambodia, how community forestry has grown in Cambodia from 113,000 hectares to 360,000 hectares. And what that means. We also need to understand more about what it means, community forestry in each of these countries, and actually how communities can benefit when they get tenure to their forests. So you can see that there's significant programs, significant targets in many of the countries in Southeast Asia. And thinking about in terms of how these countries are on track to achieve these targets, but also it's more than just the number. It's about, as I said, about the benefits. Really, what if a community gets tenure to their forests, what can they do with it? Can they cut down trees? Can they harvest trees? Do they have the technology to process the trees? If they can process the trees, that would mean more income rather than selling a tree that is standing. Thinking about all of these things and thinking about, again, going back to in terms of the issues of deforestation. So what I'm trying to show is all the different threads, the complexity of it all, of understanding the challenges and the opportunities within forest landscape. And I think community forestry programs are one key response that I think can help us think about sustainable forest management and thinking about in terms of how the impacts that will have on landscapes in the region. Other responses as well, going back to thinking about the drivers of deforestation and then trying to encourage governments, encourage companies, encourage communities to protect their forests. And that could be payments, for example, for protecting forests, so payment for ecosystem services. The program in Vietnam, for example, payment for ecosystem services is quite comprehensive. It's many challenges, I must admit, but really it's shown benefits, and shown benefits in terms of communities, for example, have incentive and are paid to protect their forests and to patrol their forests to keep out illegal loggers. And in return, basically companies, so these are state-owned companies, are paying, hydro companies are paying these communities to protect their forests. So the companies, hydro companies are benefiting because basically there's less erosion. So the reservoirs and the hydro dams are being less affected by erosion. And the communities are benefiting because they have better quality forests which to use. And they, in theory, can also benefit from these forests, for example, taking non-timber forest products, but also timber forest products. There's also REDD+, where you've got, for example, countries being paid to protect their forests, thinking about it from in terms of carbon point of view. And this could be at national level, but also down at landscape level. And again, I question many parts of REDD+, but I think it's something that as an initiative, it needs to be considered, encouraging communities and governments to protect their forests by giving the financial incentive to do so. There's also carbon offset projects where you get, for example, companies who are large emitters, and countries as well, who are large emitters basically of carbon dioxide into the greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, basically compensating for that by offsetting carbon by, for example, protecting forests, or, for example, creating forests, supporting reforestation programs.